Step out of the vehicle or you're going to jail. Your choice. Officer Eric Holloway thought he knew exactly who was behind the wheel of the high-end black SUV. In his mind, a man who looked like Dominic Shaw couldn't possibly own a car that expensive, not legally. Holloway didn't care about the speed limit, which Shaw was following perfectly. He didn't care about the valid registration sitting on the dashboard. He saw a target, not a citizen. As Holloway barks orders and rests his hand on his service weapon, he's unaware that he is being recorded by two different lenses, his own body cam and the sharp, tactical mind of the man he's profiling. Look at the man in the dark suit in the image. That is the face of a man who knows exactly how this ends. Before we reveal the moment Holloway realizes he's just fired himself, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe that the badge is a responsibility, not a license to bully, subscribe and share this story with your loved ones. Parkdale, Ohio was not always a city that made the national news. For a long time, it was just another mid-sized American city that sat quietly in the gap between what it was supposed to be and what it actually was. A place where the rhetoric of community policing had been stretched so thin over so many years that you could see clean through it like cellophane. The downtown had the bones of something that once worked. There was a library still open 3 days a week, a rec center with a leaking roof, and a stretch of small businesses along Meridian Avenue that had survived 2 recessions by sheer stubbornness. But the trust between the community and its police department had not survived. It had been quietly strangled over the course of a decade, and what remained was not peace. It was exhaustion. The first Department of Justice investigation came in 2014. It was triggered not by one incident, but by the accumulation of many, a tipping point that had been building since at least 2009, when the number of use-of-force reports filed in the Black and Hispanic neighborhoods on the city's east side began to climb at a rate that no one in City Hall could explain away with traffic patterns or crime statistics. The DOJ sent a team. They reviewed case files, interviewed residents, sat in on roll calls. And their preliminary report described what they found in language careful enough to be published, but damning enough to require action. A pattern of racially disparate stops, a culture of retaliation against officers who filed internal complaints, and a supervisory structure that had over many years learned to look away. The city settled. They agreed to reforms. A monitor was appointed. And then slowly, inexorably, things went back to the way they were. The second investigation came in 2017. This time, a coalition of civil rights attorneys had compiled data from over 400 traffic stops over an 18-month period. The numbers were not ambiguous. Black drivers in Parkdale were stopped at 3 times the rate of white drivers, despite lower rates of actual contraband recovery. The stops were concentrated in 3 patrol zones, and the officers most frequently cited in the complaints came from one specific district, the 9th. The city once again cooperated. Once again, language was committed to paper. Once again, a settlement was reached. And once again, within 24 months, the data began to trend in the wrong direction. But it was what happened between investigations that was truly suffocating. In the years separating DOJ Inquiry 1 from DOJ Inquiry 2, and from Inquiry 2 to the third, which arrived in 2021, there were 412 formal complaints filed against Parkdale officers by civilians. Of those 412, 397 were dismissed at the departmental review level, not investigated, not referred to an independent board, dismissed, stamped, filed, and buried. And the other 15 resulted in suspensions ranging from 3 days to 2 weeks. after which the officers returned to full duty without reassignment or retraining. Not one officer lost their badge during that period. Not one was prosecuted. Not one faced a consequence that lasted longer than the paperwork required to process it. What the complaints described, read in sequence, was not chaos. It was a system functioning exactly as designed. Complaint after complaint described the same choreography. A vehicle stopped for a marginal reason, a tag light, a lane change, a turn signal held a second too long. A driver ordered out, a search conducted without consent, property handled roughly, sometimes damaged, language designed to humiliate, and then the final insult, a citation for something minor or nothing at all. Just a dismissal back into traffic as if the stop had been a minor misunderstanding rather than a deliberate exercise of dominance. The victims were overwhelmingly black men between the ages of 22 and 50. Many of them were employed. Several were professionals. One was a physician. One was a high school principal. One was a pastor. None of it mattered once the blue lights came on. The third DOJ investigation, launched in the spring of 2021, was different in tone. The federal attorneys who arrived that year were not coming to negotiate. They were coming because a federal judge had grown tired of monitoring consent decrees that produced nothing. This time, the city was told plainly that if substantive, verifiable leadership change did not occur within the department's command structure within 1 year, Parkdale faced the prospect of federal receivership, an outcome that would effectively remove the mayor and city council from control of their own police force. It was not a suggestion. It was a deadline. That was the context into which the search for a new police chief began. The city needed someone from outside its own ecosystem, someone who had not grown up inside the culture of the Parkdale PD, had not been shaped by its habits and loyalties, had not learned where the bodies were buried because they had helped bury them. The search committee reviewed 43 candidates over 6 months. 39 of them were, in some meaningful way, products of the same system they were being asked to reform. 4 were not. And only one of the 4 had ever done something that no police chief in the history of Parkdale had ever attempted. Not as a PR move, not as a departmental exercise, not as a training scenario organized in advance, but alone and without announcement. He had gone undercover inside his own department. His name was Elias Shaw, and Parkdale had no idea what it had just invited through the door. Elias Shaw had not come from a family that trusted the police. That was the first thing most people never knew about him, because he wore his authority with a quiet precision that made it easy to assume he had always been on the inside of the institution. He had not. He had grown up in a neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, and where the police were not a protective presence, so much as a recurring variable in a calculation that everyone understood, but nobody wrote down. You did what you needed to do to get through the stop. You stayed composed. You did not reach for anything without announcing it, and you prayed that the officer who had pulled you over was having a decent day. He had watched his uncle, a man who worked 2 jobs and owned a small landscaping business, pulled from his truck and handcuffed on a bright September afternoon because an officer claimed the truck fit the description of a vehicle involved in a robbery 14 miles away. There was no robbery. The description was a fabrication. His uncle spent 6 hours in a holding cell before anyone apologized. And the apology was delivered in the form of a signed release form and a styrofoam cup of cold coffee. Shaw became a police officer at 23, not because he trusted the institution, but because he understood that trust had to be built from inside it or not at all. He rose through the ranks in Columbus with a reputation for something unusual in the culture of policing. He asked questions, not the kind of questions that made supervisors nervous in a performative way, but the quiet, methodical kind, the kind that got to the root of why a pattern existed before it prescribed a solution. He made detective in 5 years. He was running his own unit in 9. By the time he was 40, he had been recruited twice by the DOJ itself as a consulting analyst on systemic misconduct investigations, which was ironic because he was now the person those investigations had been summoned to replace. What distinguished Shaw from every other candidate in the pool for Parkdale's chief position was something that had never appeared in any formal performance review, because it was not the kind of thing you put in a performance review. In 2018, 6 months after being appointed chief of the Decatur Heights Police Department in a suburb of Cleveland, Shaw had taken what he privately called Day 3. He did not announce it. He did not brief his command staff. He did not bring a partner. He put on plain clothes, not the casual weekend clothes of a man trying to blend into a neighborhood, but a dark suit, a crisp white dress shirt left open at the collar, and dress shoes. And he drove a black SUV with clean plates into the neighborhoods his department was most frequently accused of targeting. He drove at or just below the speed limit. He used his signals at every turn. He stopped completely at every stop sign. He drove like a man who had studied the traffic code because he had, because he knew that the pretextual stop required a pretext, and he wanted to eliminate everyone he could think of. He was stopped twice in 3 days. The first stop was relatively uneventful in the way that an experience designed to make you feel like a criminal can still qualify as relatively uneventful. The officer was polite in the technical sense. No slurs, no raised voice. But the stop lasted 22 minutes, far longer than any legitimate traffic stop required. Shaw was asked for his license, a registration, and proof of insurance 3 separate times, as if the information might change. He was asked where he was going. He was asked where he had come from. He was asked if there was anything in the vehicle he wanted to tell the officer about. When Shaw quietly and calmly declined the request to search the vehicle, the officer's demeanor shifted in the way that certain people's demeanors shift when they encounter a variable they were not expecting. The courtesy did not disappear, but it curdled into something colder. The second stop was different in ways that kept Shaw awake for several nights afterward. The officer who pulled him over on the 3rd morning did not follow procedure. He did not maintain the standard approach distance. He reached into the window before Shaw had fully powered it down. Yet his hand found the door frame with a practiced familiarity that was not aggression, but was adjacent to it. The physical language of a man who had done this so many times that the baseline had shifted, and what he now considered normal would have made a reasonable observer deeply uncomfortable. When Shaw, in his most level voice, asked the basis for the stop, the officer told him there had been a complaint about a vehicle matching his description. There had been no complaint. Shaw knew because the dispatcher was on his payroll. What he experienced in those 3 days did not break him, but it recalibrated something. He returned to his office, wrote a 12-page internal memo, retrained 6 officers, and put 2 more under monitoring. The department's complaint rate in the targeted districts dropped by 41% over the following year. Decatur Heights became a case study. The DOJ cited it. Police reform advocates cited it. And when Parkdale's search committee came calling, they cited it too. What the committee did not know, because Shaw had never publicized it, was that he intended to do Day 3 again. He intended to do it in Parkdale. He intended to do it within the first week of his appointment, before he had spoken at a single press conference, before he had updated the letterhead, before any officer in the 9th District knew his face. He would trade his chief's uniform for the dark suit and the white shirt one more time. He would put himself in the road, and he would see exactly what Parkdale had built. He found out on the first day. Officer Dennis Holloway had been with the Parkdale Police Department for 11 years, and in that time he had collected an impressive portfolio of commendations. There were 6 in total, framed and mounted on the wall of the break room in the 9th District Station at his own quiet insistence, a fact that told you something about the man if you were paying attention. They cited things like exemplary service during a community outreach event, and outstanding performance in the apprehension of a suspect wanted for armed robbery. The armed robbery commendation was legitimate. In the spring of 2016, Holloway had pursued a suspect on foot for 3 blocks and made a clean, by-the-book arrest. Nobody disputed that. What the commendation did not mention, and what the department's internal records reflected in the passive, a redacted language of bureaucratic self-protection, was that the armed robbery arrest was something of an anomaly in Holloway's career, a bright, clean moment in a record that otherwise read like a long, methodical exercise in the abuse of discretion. Dennis Holloway had been the subject of 19 formal complaints in 7 years. 19. In a department where the average officer received fewer than 2 complaints over the course of a career, Holloway's number was not a statistical outlier. It was a statement. The complaints described a pattern with a specificity that should have been impossible to ignore. Holloway targeted black men between the ages of 25 and 55 who drove late-model vehicles and appeared, by some calculation visible only to him, to be doing well. Not conspicuously well, not flashily well. Just well enough to make him reach for the radio. Doctors, lawyers, mid-level managers, real estate agents, a retired Air Force colonel. The list of Holloway's documented victims read less like a rap sheet and more like a directory of professionals who had the misfortune of driving in the 9th District on the wrong day. His method was consistent. He would identify a vehicle, typically a dark sedan or SUV in clean condition, and observe it from a stationary position until he could articulate a pretext. Sometimes the pretext was real. A rolling stop, a failure to signal a full 100 feet before a turn, a headlight that was technically within code, but marginally dim enough to justify a question. Sometimes the pretext was invented entirely, documented in his reports with the careful vagueness of a man who had learned from experience exactly how much ambiguity a supervisor was willing to absorb. When the driver was black and male, and composed in that particular way that professional black men learn to be composed in encounters with police. A composure that costs something, that is assembled in real time from training and discipline and the memory of every conversation about what not to do. Holloway escalated. Not wildly, not with a weapon drawn or with a slur on his tongue. Slowly, methodically, with the measured precision of someone who understood that the most effective form of humiliation is the kind that cannot be proven. He had been investigated internally on 3 occasions. The first investigation, in 2016, was closed after Holloway's union representative pointed out that the complainant had a prior arrest, unrelated, years old, expunged, and the reviewing lieutenant concluded that the credibility issue was sufficient to dismiss the claim. The second investigation, in 2018, was more serious. A complainant had obtained dashcam footage from a private vehicle that had captured the encounter from across the street. The footage showed Holloway pulling a man from a vehicle. A 52-year-old cardiologist named Dr. Marcus Webb, without a stated reason, placing him against the hood and searching his car for 11 minutes while the doctor stood in the cold November air in his hospital scrubs. A stethoscope still around his neck. The footage was compelling. It was submitted. And then, quietly, and it was assessed by an internal review board that included Holloway's former partner, his current sergeant, and a lieutenant who had written one of his commendations. The case was classified as insufficient evidence of misconduct. Dr. Webb filed a civil suit. The city settled for $62,000 and a confidentiality agreement. The third investigation, in 2020, went nowhere because the complainant, a 28-year-old software engineer named Antoine James, withdrew his complaint after he told a neighbor he had received a phone call, the origin of which he refused to discuss, that persuaded him that continuing was not worth what it would cost him. Antoine James moved out of Parkdale 6 months later. He now lives in Atlanta. He does not discuss what happened in any specific detail. But when he talks about why he left Ohio, there is something in his face that only a person who has experienced a particular kind of institutional violence would recognize. What protected Holloway through 7 years and 19 complaints was not incompetence on the part of investigators. It was something more corrosive. It was a departmental culture that had learned to read certain kinds of complaints as background noise, the inevitable friction of policing in a high-activity district, and had built a review architecture that filtered that noise out before it could reach anyone with the authority and the will to act on it. His sergeant liked him. His lieutenant had fished with his father. The union was effective and well-funded and had institutional memory that stretched back 20 years. Yes, Holloway was not a monster in the eyes of the 9th District. He was, in the language that departments use when they want to say something without saying it, a good cop who was passionate about his work. What he was passionate about, in specific terms, was control. Not the control of criminals, not the control of genuinely threatening situations. The control of people who did not have to submit, but who would, because the alternative was worse. He had learned early in his career that there was a particular kind of power available to a man in a uniform on an empty road with no witnesses, and he had spent 7 years exploring its edges with the careful patience of a craftsman. He was good at it. He was, by any honest measure, exceptional at it. He was also, as of the morning of March 3rd, about to make the worst mistake of his career. Yes, he just didn't know it yet, because the man he was about to pull over looked exactly like every man he had pulled over before. A dark suit, a white shirt, a composed expression, a black SUV doing nothing wrong. Holloway pulled out of the rest stop onto the highway and began to follow. The morning of March 3rd was cold and gray in that particular way that Ohio mornings in early spring announce themselves. Not violently, just persistently. A flat gray sky sitting low over the flat gray highway like a lid. State Route 9 cut through the eastern edge of Parkdale in a long, straight line, flanked on both sides by bare tree lines and the occasional exit ramp leading toward neighborhoods that were either gentrifying or dying, depending on which block you were standing on. Traffic at 7:42 in the morning was thin. The commuter rush had not yet reached full velocity, and the road had that particular quality of an early weekday where you could see clearly for a quarter mile in any direction, where there was nothing to mistake. Elias Shaw had been on the road since 6:30. He had driven the route twice already that morning, familiarizing himself with the sight lines, the usual patrol positions, the areas where squad cars typically parked to observe traffic. He was not wearing his chief's uniform. He was not carrying his departmental identification in any visible location. He wore the dark suit and the white dress shirt, open at the collar. His badge, his actual chief's badge, was inside the leather briefcase on the back seat of the black SUV, alongside a specific set of documents he had prepared and sealed the night before. The briefcase also contained a small recording device that had been active since he left the parking garage at 6:28. His personal cell phone, through an application his technology advisor had configured, was transmitting audio in real time to a secure server. He had told no one his precise route. He had, however, left a sealed envelope with his deputy chief, with instructions that it was to be opened only if Shaw had not returned to the office by noon. He was, in every meaningful sense, on his own. And that was precisely the point. He had spotted the patrol unit at 7:39. It was parked in the shoulder of the northbound lane, approximately 40 yards past the Route 9 rest stop, positioned at the slight angle that experienced traffic officers use when they want a clear view of approaching vehicles without being immediately obvious to drivers who are looking straight ahead. Shaw had noted the unit in his rearview mirror as he passed, registered its position, and then watched through the same mirror as the car remained motionless for 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, a silver Dodge Challenger had come through the same section of road at what Shaw estimated was approximately 14 miles per hour over the speed limit, the kind of speed that, on a quiet morning with a clear road, any officer with a radar unit and an active intent to enforce traffic law would have found impossible to miss. The patrol unit did not move for the Challenger, and it moved 3 seconds after Shaw's SUV cleared the rest stop's sight line. The sequence was not subtle to someone trained to observe it, which Shaw was. He had watched the calculation happen in real time through his mirrors. One vehicle speeding, obviously dramatically offering itself as the most available and legally defensible stop within a quarter mile, and the patrol car choosing instead to follow the clean, well-maintained, perfectly operated SUV driven by a black man in a suit. The decision was made in the time it takes to blink, which is roughly how long Holloway had ever needed to make it. 14 miles per hour over the limit versus 0 violations. And still, he had chosen Shaw. This was the predatory instinct in its purest and most unguarded expression, not the impulse toward crime suppression. It was not the calculation of risk or threat assessment, but the reaching toward a specific kind of target that had nothing to do with observed behavior. Shaw had spent 3 days in Decatur Heights, collecting the same data, and he recognized it immediately, not with surprise, but with a cold, steady recognition that was worse than surprise because it contained no room for doubt. This was not an officer making a judgment call. This was an officer following a groove worn deep by years of repetition, pulling toward a particular profile the way a current pulls toward a drain. Shaw kept his speed exactly at the posted limit. He used his signal to change lanes. He kept both hands visible on the wheel. He did not accelerate. He did not brake. He drove the way a man drives when he is demonstrating for a recording and for posterity that there is no legitimate reason for what is about to happen. The lights came on at 7:44, red and blue in the mirror strobing against the gray sky. Shaw let out a slow breath through his nose. Not of fear, not of anger, but of the particular sorrow that comes from being right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. He activated his turn signal, moved to the right shoulder over 4 full seconds, and brought the SUV to a complete stop with the parking brake engaged. He placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel where they were visible through the windshield. He did not reach for anything. He did not move. He sat exactly as he had sat through 2 similar stops in Decatur Heights 3 years earlier, and with the careful stillness of a man who had learned that the first moments of a pretextual stop were the most dangerous, not because he had done anything wrong, but precisely because he had not. He watched in the side mirror as Holloway stepped out of the patrol car. Even through the mirror and the morning light, Shaw could read the body language. It was the walk of a man who already knew how this was going to go. Unhurried, authoritative, proprietary in a way that the uniform alone did not explain. The hands were loose at the sides, not tense. This was not a man approaching a traffic stop with the professional caution that training required. This was a man approaching a landscape he considered his own. Shaw watched him come. He breathed. He waited. He had been waiting for this for 7 years. Not this stop, specifically, but this moment. This particular collision between a system that had been allowed to run unchecked and the one person who had quietly, methodically prepared himself to dismantle it. The footsteps stopped at the driver's side window. A knuckle tapped the glass. Shaw powered the window down, and the two men looked at each other for the first time. The silence lasted 3 seconds before Holloway spoke, which was itself a technique, a small power assertion, the kind of pause that says, "I am in no hurry, because I have all the authority here." It was not conscious, probably. It was habit, a reflex polished by 11 years of encounters that had always ended the same way, with him holding the card. A license and registration, not "good morning," not "sir." Not the procedural identification statement that the department's own training manual specified an officer should deliver within the first 30 seconds of a vehicle stop. Just the demand, flat and unadorned, delivered with the particular economy of language that men like Holloway had developed, because they had learned that the formalities were unnecessary. They were only necessary when someone was watching. And no one was watching. Shaw did not move immediately. He responded in a voice that was steady and almost gentle, with the precision of someone who understood that every word from this point forward was both evidence and argument. He said he would be happy to provide those documents, and that he was reaching toward the glove compartment now with his right hand only, and that his other hand would remain on the steering wheel. He named each action as he performed it, not out of submission, but out of documentation, coding every movement in language that would make any later distortion of the record difficult to sustain. Holloway took the license and registration and held them for 40 seconds without looking at them. That was the tell. An officer conducting a legitimate stop examines the documents. He runs them. He returns to the vehicle if he needs more information. What he does not do is hold the documents at his side while staring through the driver's window with the focused, evaluating attention of someone trying to determine what is wrong with this picture. Because there was nothing wrong with this picture. And that fact appeared to be creating a specific kind of cognitive friction for Officer Holloway. Everything he had trained himself to read as signal, the quality of the vehicle, the clothing, the calm, the articulate manner, was pointing in the direction that usually preceded a discovery of something interesting. But the behavior itself was offering him nothing, and the absence of anything to work with was making him reach. "Where are you headed this morning?" Shaw answered precisely. He was traveling from one point in Parkdale to another. He named the cross streets. He offered no elaboration, no volunteer detail, nothing that could be taken and turned. His tone was cooperative without being deferential. He was not afraid, and he was not performing the performance of a man who was afraid. And Holloway could feel both of those things like a shift in air pressure. "Step out of the vehicle," Shaw asked, calmly, what the basis was for the request to exit the vehicle. He stated that he was cooperating fully with the stop, that he had provided all requested documentation, and that absent a specific articulable safety concern, he wanted to understand what necessitated his exiting the vehicle. He used the phrase articulable safety concern with the deliberate care of a man who knows its legal weight, who knows that the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania versus Mims established that officers could order a driver from a stopped vehicle for officer safety, but who also knows that ordering it with no stated reason, no observation of threat, and in the context of a stop with no apparent justification, was a thread you could pull. And Holloway heard the legal language, and something shifted behind his eyes. This was the moment Holloway had encountered before, in some form, with other men of similar bearing, the doctor in the scrubs, the engineer with the clean car. And what had always broken those encounters in his favor was the weight of the uniform. The uniform, the gun, the badge, the squad car on the shoulder, the implicit promise of what happened if you did not cooperate. These were the instruments of a kind of gravity that bent the encounter toward whatever Holloway needed it to be. But Shaw was not bending. He was sitting still in his seat with his hands visible and his voice level and his words calibrated with a precision that the uniform had never met before. I said, "Step out of the vehicle." Louder this time. Shaw said yes, he would step out of the vehicle. Then he reached for the door handle and identified the motion verbally as he made it, opened the door at a measured pace, and stepped out onto the asphalt. He stood at his full height, which was considerable, and he placed his hands open and visible at his sides. He was not aggressive. He was not submissive. He was present in the full, occupying way of a man who understood that this stretch of road belonged to both of them equally, regardless of who was holding the badge. Holloway told him to put his hands on the hood. Shaw said he did not consent to that. He stated he was not detained subject to a Terry stop, that no reasonable articulable suspicion of criminal activity had been stated or, to his knowledge, existed, and that placing his hands on the hood of the vehicle would constitute an unlawful detention absent a legal basis. Not he spoke the words with no elevation of voice, no tremor, no challenge in his face, just words, just the law returned to the man who was supposed to be its instrument. The frustration that crossed Holloway's face in that moment was visible and specific. It was not the frustration of an officer encountering a difficult situation. It was the frustration of a predator encountering unexpected resistance. The particular anger of a man who has done this dozens of times and never had it not work, who is now confronting the first iteration that is pushing back in a language he cannot easily outrun. He took a step forward. His hand moved to Shaw's shoulder. The pressure was controlled, measured, technically not assault but adjacent to it. The physical punctuation of a command being enforced without the legal foundation to enforce it. Shaw did not resist. He allowed his hands to be placed on the hood of the SUV. He kept his voice absolutely level, and then he said, quietly, to the open air, and to the recording device in the briefcase on the back seat, and to the GPS-linked audio feed transmitting to the secure server, "I am complying under protest. I am not consenting to this detention, and I am documenting that I have been physically directed to this position without stated legal cause." Holloway did not respond. He was already moving toward the back of the vehicle. His hand found the trunk release. "I'm going to take a look in here." Shaw said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He had said everything already, and the briefcase on the back seat was waiting, with a patience that 11 years of impunity had never once prepared Holloway to understand. And there is a particular silence that falls over a moment when reality refuses to cooperate with the story someone has spent years telling themselves. It is not a dramatic silence. It is not the silence of a movie climax with a swelling score and a slow-motion reveal. It is quieter than that, and heavier, and far more final. It is the silence of a door closing on everything that came before. Holloway popped the trunk without consent, without cause, and without hesitation, which was the most damning thing about it, that there was no hesitation. This was not a man making a difficult judgment call under pressure. This was a man reaching automatically for a tool he had used so many times that he no longer thought about it. The pretextual search, the trunk opening, the expectation of something to justify what had already been done. Because in Holloway's experience, and in the experience of every officer who had learned to operate the way he operated, there was usually something. Not always drugs or weapons, sometimes just the presence of something that could be described as suspicious in a report. Bag, a box, a tool, a receipt for something that could be made to sound wrong in the right language. Something that turned the illegal search into the origin story of a legitimate arrest. Something that made the whole chain of events retroactively justifiable in the narrative that would end up in a report. The trunk opened. Holloway leaned in. There was one item in the trunk, a black leather briefcase, expensive and well-made, with brass clasps and a combination lock. Sitting in the center of the cargo area with the composed confidence of an object that had been placed there deliberately, Holloway lifted it out and set it on the rear bumper. He examined the combination lock. He looked back at Shaw, who was still standing at the hood of the vehicle, with his hands visible, watching Holloway over his own shoulder with an expression that was difficult to read. Not angry, not afraid, not smug. Something else. Something that, if Holloway had been paying close attention, he might have recognized as the look of a man watching the last move of a game that had already been won. Holloway attempted to open the briefcase. The combination resisted him. He looked back at Shaw. "What's in the bag?" Shaw turned slowly from the hood of the vehicle, straightening to his full height. And then, for the first time since the stop began, the quality of his stillness changed. Not dramatically, not with anger, but with a finality, a settling into position, like a judge reaching for a gavel. He walked to the rear of the vehicle. He looked at the briefcase on the bumper. He looked at Holloway. And then he said, in a voice that was no longer the carefully modulated voice of a man managing a traffic stop, but something plainer and quieter and more absolute. "You've opened my trunk without my consent, and without legal cause. That's the last decision you'll be making as an officer today. Open the briefcase." Holloway stared at him. The words had landed differently than any pushback he had ever received on the side of a road. Not because they were louder, yes, but because they were accompanied by a certainty that had no equivalent in his experience. He had been met with anger before. Anger was manageable. Anger was documentable. Anger was a gift. He had been met with calm before. Calm was usually the calm of resignation, of a man deciding that the cost of resistance was too high. What he was meeting now was neither. This was the calm of a man who had already won and was simply closing the books. Shaw reached out and turned both combination locks simultaneously. The clasps released with two clean clicks. The lid opened. Holloway looked inside. There was no contraband. There were no drugs. There were no weapons or stolen goods or any of the artifacts of criminality that Holloway's 45-minute stop was supposed to produce. What was inside the briefcase was paper. Specifically, there were 3 items laid out in a precise arrangement that suggested they had been organized not in a hurry, but with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly how this moment would unfold. The first was a gold shield, a chief of police badge, from the Parkdale Police Department, catching the morning light with a clarity that Holloway felt in his sternum before his brain had fully processed what it was seeing. The second was a laminated identification card that bore, alongside a photograph of the man standing in front of him, the words, Chief of Police, Parkdale Police Department, in the department's official typeface. The third item was a sealed envelope. On the front of the envelope, in neat printed letters, were two words, for Holloway. Dennis Holloway's body understood what was happening before his mind agreed to accept it. His hands went slightly cold. The world seemed to recalibrate along an axis he could not have anticipated. He looked from the briefcase to the man standing before him, and the man was watching him with those same steady eyes and that same level expression, waiting, and behind the steadiness, there was something that was not satisfaction exactly. That would have been too small a word, but a kind of grief. The grief of a man who had hoped to be wrong and had not been, who had walked into the fire knowing it was there and had been burned anyway, who was now standing in the smoke of something that could not be undone, doing the only thing left to do. Holloway's hand moved slowly toward the envelope. Shaw did not stop him. He opened it. Inside was a single page, dense with the formal language of official documents, bearing the Parkdale Police Department seal at the top. His own name appeared in the first line. He read the document once. He read it again. He looked up. What the envelope contained was an administrative notice of termination, effective immediately, signed by the Chief of Police. Signed by the man standing in front of him on the side of State Route 9 in the dark suit and the white shirt, whose perfectly operated black SUV was still sitting on the shoulder, recording everything. The notice cited 19 counts of documented misconduct. It cited 3 department investigations. It cited the illegal trunk search conducted 11 minutes ago, which had been captured on Shaw's personal recording device, on the GPS-linked audio feed, and, Shaw now revealed by reaching into the briefcase a final time, and on the 2 body-mounted cameras he had worn, concealed beneath his jacket. The morning was very quiet. Somewhere down the highway, a car passed without stopping. The birds in the bare tree line did not pause. The world continued in its routine, unhurried way. And on the shoulder of Route 9, a man who had used a uniform as a weapon for 7 years stood holding his own termination papers while the sky sat gray and indifferent above them both. Holloway's mouth opened. No sound came out. Shaw said, "Don't." What happened next was not cinematic. Shaw had spent enough time in law enforcement to know that the moments of genuine institutional accountability rarely were. They did not arrive with music or tears or a clean moral catharsis. They arrived in the practical, procedural language of consequences being administered, which was its own kind of justice, not the satisfying kind from films, but the durable kind that actually changed things, the kind that left a record. Shaw took out his phone. He dialed the 9th District command line. When the desk sergeant answered, Shaw identified himself, gave his rank and badge number, stated his current location to the nearest intersection, and requested that the on-duty watch commander come to his position immediately. The desk sergeant's voice carried the particular careful neutrality of someone who was not yet sure what they were hearing. Shaw gave the order a second time, clearly, and then ended the call. He looked at Holloway, who was still standing at the rear bumper of the SUV with the termination papers in his hand. And something had changed in Holloway's posture over the last 90 seconds. The authority had evacuated it, and what remained was something more ordinary and more terrible than authority. A man standing in the open air, suddenly without the architecture that had defined him, trying to understand what his body was supposed to do when the thing it had always counted on was gone. He looked, Shaw thought, not unlike the men he had left on the side of roads for 7 years. exposed, diminished, made small by a situation he had not seen coming and could not navigate out of. Shaw did not feel the pleasure he had anticipated. He had examined that possibility in the days he'd spent preparing for this, and had acknowledged to himself that there might be some satisfaction in it, and had decided that satisfaction was acceptable, that a man was allowed to feel the resolution of something that had demanded resolving. But what he actually felt, standing there on the asphalt with the gray sky overhead and the recording devices running and Holloway's face doing the quiet arithmetic of ruin, was something closer to sorrow. Not for Holloway, for the 19 people, for Dr. Webb in his scrubs on a November afternoon, for Antoine James, who now lived in Atlanta and did not talk about Ohio, for his own uncle, who had stood against a truck on a September morning with his hands raised while his landscaping equipment sat in the bed behind him and a city moved past without slowing down. For every stop that had not been recorded, not reported, not reviewed, the stops that lived only in the bodies of the men who had experienced them, and in the way they tensed when lights appeared in their mirrors, in the routes they changed and the times they shifted, and the quiet, ongoing labor of managing a world that had decided they were perpetually suspect. The watch commander arrived in 9 minutes. His name was Lieutenant Renner, a heavy-set man in his late 40s with the careful face of someone who had navigated a complicated institution for a long time by staying as close to the center as possible. He pulled his vehicle in behind Holloway's patrol car, stepped out, took in the scene, Shaw standing at the rear of the SUV, Holloway at the bumper with a piece of paper in his hand, and began walking forward with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that whatever this was, it was going to require him to be very precise about everything he said. Shaw identified himself. He showed his badge. He showed his department ID. He watched Renner process this information in real time. The chief's badge, the suit, the location, the facts, and watched the precise moment that the full shape of the situation landed on the lieutenant's understanding. Renner's face did not betray panic, which was a point in his favor, but it did betray the specific kind of stillness that comes from recognizing that you are standing inside a moment that will be discussed for a long time. Shaw described what had occurred since 7:44 that morning. He was thorough and specific. He cited the stop with no observed violation, the demand for exit without articulable safety concern, the physical direction to the hood of the vehicle without stated cause, and in the warrantless search of the trunk conducted without consent or legal basis. He stated that the entirety of the encounter had been captured on personal recording equipment and transmitted in real time to a secure server. He handed Renner a copy of the administrative notice of termination. A second copy, he explained, as Officer Holloway already had one. Renner looked at the termination notice. He looked at Holloway. He looked at Shaw. And then he did the thing that would define him in the account of this morning for the rest of his career. He didn't argue. He didn't reach for procedural language or union protocols or the reflexive institutional protections that had shielded men like Holloway for 7 years. He simply nodded once. In the way a man nods when he has known for a long time that something needed to happen and is experiencing the complicated relief of watching it happen at last. He turned to Holloway and asked for his badge and his service weapon. The 4 words hung in the cold morning air between the 3 men. Holloway looked at the badge on his chest. He looked at Renner. He looked at Shaw. There was a moment, no more than 2 or 3 seconds, where something moved across Holloway's face that might have been the ghost of defiance, the reflex of a man who had never been told no by the institution that had housed and protected and commended and shielded him for 11 years. And then it passed. because the institution was standing in front of him in a dark suit, and it had told him no. Holloway unclipped his badge. He removed his holster, and he held both items out to Renner with hands that, for the first time in their encounter that morning, were not steady. Renner took them. He placed them in his vehicle. He told Holloway to ride with him and that department procedure would be followed from this point forward regarding union notification and processing. Holloway walked to Renner's vehicle without looking back at Shaw. Shaw watched the door close. He watched the patrol car and the watch commander's vehicle sit on the shoulder for a moment, and then he bent down, picked up his briefcase, lighter now, 3 items fewer, closed it, and placed it back in the trunk of the SUV. He closed the trunk. He got in the driver's seat. He placed his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. He sat there for a moment in the quiet of the car. Then he drove back toward the city. He had a meeting with his command staff at 9. He was going to be on time. The conference room on the 3rd floor of the Parkdale Police Department's headquarters had seen a great many meetings over the years, but not many like this one. The table was long and dark and surrounded by men and women who had spent their careers inside the architecture of the institution, who understood its pressures and its unspoken rules and its geography of loyalty and protection. There were 11 of them, 2 deputy chiefs, 4 captains, and 5 lieutenants, including Renner, whose face, when he entered the room, carried the particular look of a man who has already lived through the story that is about to be told to everyone else. They had all received the same message at 8:15 that morning. Mandatory meeting, 3rd floor, 9 a.m., was attendance non-negotiable. The message had come from the chief's office. Most of them, when it arrived, did not yet know they had a chief. Shaw walked in at 8:59. He was still wearing the dark suit and the white shirt. He had made no adjustment to his appearance since returning from Route 9, and that choice was deliberate. He wanted the room to understand what they were looking at, wanted the clothes to do the preliminary work of establishing context before a single word was spoken. He set his briefcase on the table. He placed a laptop at the head of the table and connected it to the room's display screen. He did not sit down. He did not open with introductions or pleasantries or the kind of ceremonial framing that new leadership typically used to establish tone. He pressed play. The footage ran for 41 minutes. It was the composite recording from the 2 body cameras and the briefcase audio device, edited together into a single sequential document by Shaw's technology advisor between 7:45 and 8:30 that morning. The room watched it in the particular silence of people who are processing something that requires them to simultaneously absorb information and reassess their own position in relation to it. They watched a man in a dark suit pulled over on a clear morning road with no stated cause. They watched him provide documents that were held for 40 seconds without examination. They watched him asked to exit the vehicle with no legal basis. They watched him directed to the hood of the car. They watched a trunk opened without consent. They watched the briefcase lifted out, and then they watched the moment of opening, the badge, the ID, the envelope, and they watched Holloway's face do what faces do when the floor falls away. Nobody in the room spoke during the footage. After it ended, the silence continued for 10 seconds. Then one of the captains, a 22-year veteran named Captain Anita Flores, who ran the community policing division and who had filed 2 internal complaints against Holloway that had both been dismissed, made a small, tight sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a syllable, as if her body had been holding something for a very long time and had just released a fraction of it. Shaw turned from the screen and looked at the room. He spoke for 12 minutes. Not long by the standards of the speeches new leaders typically gave, but every sentence was load-bearing, and he told them what the footage had shown, as if they needed telling, which they did not. But the act of naming it in clear language in front of the full room was itself a statement about how things were going to work now. He told them that Holloway's termination was the beginning of a process, not the entirety of it. He told them that the DOJ's third investigation into the department was not going to end with another consent decree and another appointed monitor and another agreement that would be allowed to dissolve over time. It was going to end with a transformed department, and the transformation was going to be verified by data that they were going to collect themselves, and the data was going to be public, and it was going to be reviewed quarterly by a community board with actual authority to make referrals, not just recommendations. And he told them that he had reviewed the complaint records before accepting the position. He told them that he was aware of the 19 complaints against Holloway. He told them that he was also aware of 11 complaints against 3 other officers in the 9th District with similar patterns, and that those reviews were already in progress. He told them that any supervisor in the room who had reviewed and dismissed a complaint from those files without conducting a genuine investigation was going to have the opportunity, in a private meeting with Shaw in the coming week, to explain their reasoning. He told them that those conversations were not punitive in nature, not yet, but that their outcome would determine what happened next. And then he said the thing that the room would talk about, and that Renner would tell his daughter about 20 years later when she was studying criminal justice at Ohio State, that Captain Flores would quote in the speech she gave when she was named Parkdale's first Deputy Chief of Community Accountability. Shaw said, "You took an oath. That oath doesn't care about the union contract. That oath doesn't care about what your sergeant told you was standard practice in the 9th. That oath is not a suggestion, and it is not a historical document. It is a daily obligation. Every stop, every interaction, every decision made on every road in this city at every hour. You follow the Constitution or you follow Holloway out the door. There is no third option. That door does not lock from the inside." He picked up his briefcase. And he told them the meeting was adjourned and that his calendar was open between 2 and 5 for anyone who wanted to speak with him directly. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. He looked at the room, at the captains and the lieutenants and the deputy chiefs, at the accumulated weight of careers built inside a system that had asked them to absorb things they should have refused, at the faces of people who were not all bad actors, who were, in many cases, good people, who had been shaped over time into the silence that systems require to sustain their worst habits. He told them, "The people in this city are watching. They have been watching for a long time. What they have seen has cost them things they will never fully recover. What they see from now on is up to you." Then he left. Behind him, the room sat very still. And somewhere in that stillness, in the uncomfortable, irreversible way that certain truths make themselves at home in the spaces between people, something began to shift. 5 years is a short time to reform a police department. Anyone who tells you otherwise has either never tried or has redefined reform in a way that requires no actual change. What happened in Parkdale in the 5 years following the morning of March 3rd was not magic, and it was not painless, and it was not, if you spoke to the people on the east side of the city who had lived through the worst of it, ever quite enough. The wounds that decades of institutional misconduct leave in a community do not heal on the timeline of a press release or a consent decree or even a genuinely committed new chief. They heal slowly, if at all, And they leave scar tissue, and the scar tissue is itself a kind of testament to what happened there, a record written in the bodies and the habits and the quiet defensive architectures of people who learned early that protection was not guaranteed. But something did change, and what changed was real. In the first 18 months of Shaw's tenure, 41 officers separated from the Parkdale Police Department. 11 were terminated following the internal reviews Shaw had initiated. 22 resigned voluntarily during the first year, which those watching the department closely understood to mean that they had assessed the new environment and concluded that it was no longer hospitable to the way they had been doing business. 8 retired. 3 were reassigned to administrative roles pending the resolution of ongoing civil complaints from prior years. The department shrank before it grew, which was the correct order of operations. Shaw had said from the beginning that a smaller department with a genuine commitment to its mandate was more valuable than a large one with a culture of impunity, and the Parkdale City Council, staring down the barrel of federal receivership and 3 separate DOJ consent decrees, found they agreed with him. The complaint data changed within the first year. Not dramatically at first. The most important changes rarely announce themselves dramatically, but the trend line was consistent and in the right direction. Civilian complaints decreased by 31% in year 1, 47% in year 2. More significantly, and the complaints that were filed were now being investigated. Not cleared, not dismissed at the first tier, investigated, documented, adjudicated by the independent review board that Shaw's reform package had established with actual subpoena power and the authority to recommend termination. The board, composed of 7 civilians, including 2 attorneys, a physician, a retired educator, and 3 community residents selected through an open application process, heard 46 cases in its first operational year. 12 resulted in formal disciplinary action. 2 resulted in terminations. All 12 were upheld on appeal. The body cam program, which had existed in the department before Shaw arrived, but had been applied inconsistently and reviewed almost never, became mandatory and non-negotiable. Every patrol officer in every district wore a camera on every shift. The footage was retained for 90 days and could be requested by any citizen who had been involved in a stop or an encounter. There was resistance to this, and the resistance was loud and organized, and the union filed 3 separate grievances, all of which were resolved through the arbitration process with the cameras remaining in place. Shaw did not negotiate on cameras. He said so publicly in a community meeting in the 9th District in the first month of his tenure, in a room packed with 300 residents who had come because they had heard the story of Route 9 and wanted to see the man who had lived it. He said, "The camera is not a threat to officers who follow the law. It is a threat to officers who do not. If your officer is afraid of the camera, that fear is information." The DOJ closed its 3rd investigation in 2024 with a finding that, for the first time in the history of the 3 investigations, did not recommend federal intervention. It recommended continued monitoring, which was a different thing entirely. It cited Parkdale as a department that had demonstrated measurable, verifiable progress toward constitutional policing in a compressed time frame, and noted Shaw's methodology as a potential model for departments facing similar systemic challenges. The report was 12 pages. Shaw read it once, set it on his desk, and went back to work. The national attention came in waves. First, the civil rights organizations, who had been watching Parkdale since the Route 9 footage was released as part of Holloway's termination proceedings, and then the academic community. 2 criminology journals published analyses of the Parkdale data within 18 months. Then the police reform advocacy world, which invited Shaw to speak at conferences in 7 cities, all of which he attended and none of which he allowed to become celebrations. He was consistent about that. He told every audience that what had happened in Parkdale was not a success story yet. It was a correction. The success story had not been written. It was being written daily by officers who chose, shift after shift, to do their jobs in accordance with the oath they had taken, and by residents who were slowly, cautiously, beginning to extend to those officers a trust they had every historical reason to withhold. 3 police academies in Ohio, Michigan, and Georgia incorporated the Route 9 footage and Shaw's methodology into their training curricula by 2026. The Parkdale case was not taught as a story of heroism because Shaw himself had specifically requested it not be framed that way. It was taught as a case study in systemic accountability. What happens when the architecture of protection is removed from predatory conduct? What happens when a complaint number becomes too high to ignore? What happens when the person who conducts the undercover test is the person with the authority to act on what they find? Dennis Holloway did not fight his termination through the courts. The recording was too complete and too clear, and the union, after reviewing its contents, concluded that a legal battle would produce a public record that served no one's interest, including the union's. His termination was processed, and with it went his pension eligibility, a determination made on the basis that the termination was for cause, and specifically for cause that had been documented across a period exceeding 7 years, which placed it within the category of willful and sustained misconduct. He appealed the pension determination. The appeal was heard by a review board that had access to all 19 complaints, the 3 departmental investigations, the civil settlement with Dr. Webb, and 41 minutes of footage from Route 9. The appeal was denied in 4 months, which was, by the standards of bureaucratic review timelines, nearly immediate. He moved out of Parkdale within a year. Where exactly was not publicized, which was as it should be. He was a private citizen now. Private citizens were entitled to their privacy, even the ones who had spent 7 years systematically denying it to others. His name appeared in the curricula of those 3 police academies, not as a monster, not as an aberration, but as a type, a recognizable configuration of authority and habit and institutional protection that could emerge anywhere the conditions permitted it, that had emerged in Parkdale and in 1,000 other cities and would emerge again wherever accountability was made optional and impunity was made routine. The cadets who watched the footage and read the case study were asked at the end of the lesson a single question. Not, what did Holloway do wrong? That was obvious. They were asked, what did the system do that made Holloway possible? Because the system was the lesson. Holloway was just the test that the system had, for 11 years, failed. The test results were on record. The corrections were ongoing. The work was not finished. On the morning of March 3rd, 5 years after Route 9, Shaw drove the same road again. Same suit, same white shirt, same black SUV. He drove at the posted limit with his signals used and his stops complete. He drove through the 9th District and the 4th District and out toward the eastern edge of Parkdale where the tree lines began. He drove for 40 minutes and nothing happened. No lights, no sirens, no patrol car pulling out behind him from a rest stop shoulder. He drove in the unremarkable, uneventful quiet of a man moving through a city that was not yet healed, but was, incrementally, trying. That was not a small thing. After everything that had come before it, and that was not a small thing at all.